Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to our November edition of the Live and Know Data Science Seminar Series. So today we're really happy to be joined by Smera Jayadeva. So Smera is a researcher in AI ethics, data science, and responsible research innovation at the Alan Turing Institute, and is talking to us today about putting ethical values and principles into practice across your AI project lifecycle. So without further ado, when you're ready to get going, please feel free.
Yes, sorry, 1 second. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to try and keep this quick when it comes to the content of it, and hopefully keep more time for questions. Just before I get started, a quick introduction to myself. I'm a researcher within data justice and global ethical futures, which sits within the ethics theme of the public policy program at the Turing Institute. Today, I'll be walking you through a recent training program and framework that we have called the AI Ethics and Governance in Practice series. I will try and give as many examples as possible to keep it relevant to the audience, and hopefully it does interest you and you choose to have more ethical and responsible approaches to your AI projects. So to begin with, just want to give everyone a quick overview of the history of how this public sector program came to be. We collaborated with the Office for AI to provide the first national guidance on public sector AI ethics and safety. This would serve as an extension of the national AI strategy, and importantly, it looks at moving from principles to practice in AI policy and governance literature. So it's then unsurprising that a lot of this work is cited in many risk assessment frameworks, because ensuring that responsibility and that element of ethical approaches is fundamental to both public sector as well as private sector use and deployment of AI systems. So the AI Ethics and Governance in Practice training program is essentially aimed at supporting the public sector with the culture, skills, and tools to adopt state-of-the-art practices in responsible and trustworthy AI innovation. This was primarily designed for the public sector, with a lot of the training modules being co-developed with numerous partners from across the UK. So we've not only worked with, say, organizations like the ICO and their relevant guidance on data protection, but also the Equality and Human Rights Commission and their work on the public sector equality duty. In order to ensure that our work was co-designed and has that practical element when it comes to implementation, we work with a number of partners, including the Ministry of Justice and the Digital Office for Scottish Local Government, to pilot the workshops that we did that finally resulted in a series of 8 modules. Now, these modules go from a basic introduction to AI concepts, from what is machine learning, what kind of data is important, to considerations of ethics and governance that's relevant to the public sector. It then goes into sustainability as part 1 and 2, which deals with ensuring social sustainability and the project sustainability as it reflects on contextual issues as they arise. Then fairness, responsible data stewardship, safety, transparency and explainability, and finally AI accountability. Each of these modules deals with a specific domain in order to give those who are reading it an idea of the different ways in which AI is being used, as well as the different issues that might arise with AI use. So just as a fair warning, if you are looking at using AI or developing AI in healthcare, it's not necessary. It shouldn't be that you only adhere to the AI fairness in practice workbook, but try and look at every single workbook to ensure that there is that end-to-end accountability. Now, each of these modules includes practical activities, discussions, and reflections to ensure that those principles that are contained in each of the workbooks are brought about in a way that incites this ethical reflection on AI in practice. All of these workbooks are publicly available and open access. And I quickly wanted to also mention that this is also available on an online platform that we have, where you can access this either as a HTML version or download the entire module for offline use and printing. So if you are to maybe look into training other individuals into why this is relevant, this could also be an important resource. But for the sake of this talk, I'm going to try and focus on why these different principles are important, how it comes about in different domains, and why that principle of accountability is important in ensuring responsible research innovation. I will return to this slide once we go through all of the principles and values, when we can hopefully understand why there is this layout of the 8 workbooks. So beginning with a simple definition of AI ethics as a set of values, principles, and techniques that employ widely accepted standards of right and wrong to guide moral conduct in the development and use of AI technologies. Now, this is a fairly wide definition that can support the initial stages of an ethical AI project, to ensure that, again, there are widely acceptable standards of what is right and wrong, and without being bogged down by the debates within philosophy as to what are those moral concerns we're doing. And an important part of how this is going to be implemented is the use of the AI project lifecycle. This is an abstraction of a project lifecycle, so which goes from design, development to deployment, and at each stage looks at different questions and responsibilities, from, say, project planning and asking the question of why we are using AI at this specific moment, to the kind of data that we're planning on using, how we're reporting all of that information, and finally an important consideration of whether we will be updating a model or deprovisioning or decommissioning, because decommissioning is also a very important element, and we shouldn't just continue the use of AI systems if it is not an ethical mode of use. Now, the process-based governance is a huge part of the work, is the grounding framework of the work that we've done. It begins with a level 1 consideration of the sum values, which support, underwrite, and motivate responsible AI projects. So this is the basic foundational criteria to assess potential social and ethical impacts. Now, we relate these sum values to certain risks and ethical implications that might arise from loss of autonomy, interpersonal connection, poor quality outcomes, and even questions of bias and injustice, and how that relates to our sum values, such as making sure all those involved are treated with a level of respect, that there is that element of connection, which is often lost with increasing use of digital modes of communication or interaction, that there is care for the well-being of all individuals, as well as the protection that comes from existing legislation, as well as our moral compasses that guide how we should ensure that these social values are implemented. The second phase of it is the safety principles. Now, these are the more actionable goals that are built upon these basic principles of respect, connect, care, and protect. And finally, that goes into the level 3, or the process-based governance framework. So they're all built one upon another. And these actionable goals primarily look at sustainability. So looking at AI projects being developed with sensitivity to real-world impacts and contextual issues that might arise. Safety and the importance of assuring technically accurate, reliable, secure, and robust systems. Accountability across the project. Fairness to ensure there is a minimum threshold of discriminatory, non-harm, and bias mitigation. Explainability, not just to justify how a system came to that outcome, but to also justify, but also the explanation that we need to give to different individuals who will be interacting with the system. And finally, data stewardship, which looks at data quality, integrity, protection, and privacy. I will be going through all of these specific actionable goals through some examples, as well as the templates that we provide to ensure that these goals can be achieved and justifiable. So with my research, I came across numerous examples of, say, AI being used to build next generation infrastructure to improve cost effectiveness and maintenance of aging infrastructure. And that maintenance is also, raised the important examples of digital twins, which is a lot of the work that the Turing does in infrastructure and construction, as well as other fields, to have a digital twin of assets such as bridges or buildings, where we can see the different data that goes into it, implement and see what different interventions and implementations might lead in terms of outcomes in a digital space itself, which all seems well and good. But an important part of that is to ensure that as we go through such projects in the use or in AI use and infrastructure building and so forth, is to ask questions of what this AI system will be, ask questions of who will be involved in this, give an overview of the type of algorithms and techniques being used, and so forth. Now, this project summary template will also be used, is not just a template to be used and a one-time use, but we will be revisiting it over the course of the work. But as you can see with the questions, it's essentially a place to start noting down the different areas, decisions, and considerations that are taking place in order to implement, say, an AI project in infrastructure. We also got an interesting case of AI being used in urban planning and town management and so forth, especially with the increasing use of generative AI. And in this specific workbook, we use urban planning as a specific case study to guide some of the activities. But what's important here is, whilst there is this idea of using AI in urban planning for improved public benefits, so using it to identify areas where better buildings can be developed or other modes of transportation and so forth, what's important is to make sure that this is done with the engagement of the individuals who will be impacted by this use. So having that trade-off between costs and benefits, and looking at both the principles and those consequences that might arise. And a huge part of that for us is that public consultation element, rather than just implementing an AI system which is used without engagement with any of the groups involved in, say, a particular neighborhood. It's important to have a specific form of public consultation that not only looks into, say, the resources and the considerations for the specific socioeconomic contextual considerations that might arise with the groups on whom this AI system might be used. So we then provide the stakeholder impact assessment, where this goes into various sections of horizon scanning and looking at the different decisions being taken in terms of the type of technology that exists, the current user needs, for instance, the type of policy problems we're trying to solve, and so forth. As you can see, we're seeing where we can hold certain individuals accountable for the decisions being made, as you can see, with team members being involved. And then we have important examples across in public sector for, say, police and criminal justice services in facial recognition, AI being used in the healthcare services for diagnostics or for administrative purposes, and even interestingly, AI being used to improve Welsh language technology, which is something very interesting that I came across, where the Welsh government is working alongside this industry, working along with the industry in order to provide a respectful way of protecting the Welsh language, as well as doing more to improve accessibility to all these services. But just taking these three cases, we can see how each of them immediately might raise a red flag in our minds when it comes to the kind of audience and the kind of people on whom it's being used. There are numerous cases of facial recognition gone wrong on certain people with certain protected classes. We also seen how use of AI in healthcare might lead to discriminatory outcomes, either on the administrative side of it or in the diagnostic process, if it's not built on fair metrics, right? For this, we provide the bias self-assessment and bias risk management template and the fairness position statement. Within this workbook, we also provide a huge taxonomy of different biases that we categorize into world, data, ecosystem, and so forth. And these biases can be used to better categorize the kind of issues that are taking place, as well as monitor the different ways in which we can take actions to mitigate the risks that might arise from this use. Then we have a really interesting case, say with Google DeepMind's GraphCast for climate modeling, how climate change can be monitored with AI, with NASA and IBM creating new AI models for weather change prediction and predicting anomalies and so forth. And this might well seem like a fairly reasonable, a non-ethically bound issue, so long as we look beyond those considerations of, say, how AI systems in their development and so forth use massive amounts of energy. But largely, this seems like a case where you might not have as many pressing ethical concerns. But unfortunately, that is not the case, because we found that there are numerous cases where climate change data and climate data is often better recorded in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere. So if we are going to be using such models to monitor a lot of the change happening in, say, in the southern hemisphere, is the data that we're using useful? Are they making the right predictions? Are they making efficient use of the kind of quality considerations of the quality and quantity of data? So for this, we have a data fact sheet where we're essentially trying to assess the kind of tools that we're using for protection, but also looking at where the data might be sourced from, why were these data models chosen, and what risks or biases might be present within that data. And as I bring in the concept of bias, we can already see how, different elements of these templates and different elements of this governance framework does respond to other elements within the framework. So data stewardship also requires a consideration of those fairness metrics that I had earlier mentioned. Then we have an interesting case of, say, AI in automated cars and so forth. So, which seems, again, something that could revolutionize transport and movement and accessibility for numerous individuals. But we've also seen how it has fatal consequences, and sometimes has failures in recognizing something as simple as a kangaroo, which you or I might be very proud of being able to recognize from a distance. But we also see cases where there are cars that there were self-driving cars that couldn't recognize a white truck coming towards it because because the day was really hot, and therefore it camouflaged with the brightness that was coming on the other end. So all of these raise important questions of safety considerations to ensure that these issues, that safety considerations of reliability, robustness, brittleness are all considered before a model is designed, and how it's going to be considered when it's being developed and finally deployed. In our safety workbook, we look at AI in transport services, and we give give those who are being trained the case study of, say, the highway code being updated, and whether these models are able to reflect and respond to this updated highway code, and the issues that might arise when it comes to its performance, if these updates in the highway code were not taken into consideration. And then we have the infamous black box problem, and asking how and why this decision came to be. What is important for us is that we try to move beyond just giving an explanation of just why of how the outcome was achieved, but also give an explanation for rationale, responsibility, who is being held responsible for the decisions that are taking place, fairness, the fairness metrics that went into designing the system, the data that went into designing the system, the safety considerations, if and at all they were considered in the development of an AI system, and finally the impacts that arise from this. Now, I haven't given a specific example that might relate to today's audience, but in our workbook, we deal with the case study of using an AI system in children's social care. Which, as you can imagine, is a very sensitive domain in which to be using such AI systems. So if a child is being rehoused away from their family, not only do we have to give an explanation to the family and the child as to how these decisions were being made, but also why these decisions were being made. And we think when we think about the child, thinking about the kind of knowledge that they might have, how are we going to be able to condense these really complicated subjects into and concepts into a way that even a child can understand how and why a decision was made on their future outcome. So for this, to answer those questions, we use the explainability assurance management template, which goes back to asking questions from the stakeholder engagement process, which we had already recorded, to understand the explanations for rationale and responsibility, but also checklists to make sure that all the information that we provided, is responsive to the contextual factors of the domain in which it's being used. We say one of the questions is, we've made it clear how decision recipients can contact us if they want to discuss how AI-assisted decisions are being made. And finally, we put this all together into the PBG log, or the process-based governance log, where we log all the governance actions from, say, the stakeholder engagement process, impact assessment, safety self-assessment, bias management, fairness position statement, data fact sheet, and the framework to ensure that all of this is all of these decisions being made have an individual whom we can hold responsible. And this framework is to really confront that accountability gap that often arises with the use of AI systems, where we cannot hold an algorithm or a model responsible for its outcomes, but we have to hold a human who developed and made decisions for the use, design and development of that model, to ensure that it is used in a justifiable, transparent, and fair way. And this can then build on that public trust for all the communities on whom it's being used. And an important part, as you can see to maybe the right of this image, is revisitation. So say in the process of developing and designing these models, we've come across certain issues, say at a much later stage. It's very important to revisit earlier artifacts or templates, to update them as with the new information that we've been giving. So now you can see how all of these different principles and values and templates can all respond to each other in order to give that end-to-end accountability and really put those principles into practice in a meaningful way for all individuals involved. And again, whilst this workbook was aimed at the public sector, the kind of principles and values and the methods of using these workbooks is not something that is not of use to, say, industry, private sector, media, and so forth. These are all principles that we should collectively share and uphold in order to ensure the use of AI systems is done in a way that's explainable, sustainable, fair, respectful of and protective of the data, safe, and finally accountable for the final outcomes of a model. Finally, I quickly wanted to give some more resources that might be of interest, because we've used this PBG framework with other guidance as well. We've worked with the Department of Business and Trade to provide guidance on how to ethically adopt and use AI and data-driven technology. We use a lot of case studies in this guidance that responds to the domain of business and commerce. And importantly, and very recently, we've worked with the Council of Europe to develop the Human Rights, Democracy, and Rule of Law Impact Assessment, or HUDERIA, where we use stakeholder engagement as one of the key components. This would be a framework that can accompany the world's first binding treaty on AI use. So that should hopefully give a bit of a conversation starter, and I'm happy to take any questions and share any resources that people might be interested in.
Great, thanks very much. So we've got plenty of time for questions. So we'll start with questions in the room, then we'll move to questions online. So yeah, David.
I was very interested when you were talking about explainability and how, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So you gave examples of a child who's been taken into care and how they might want to be given that. Do you actually have an example of what they would be given? Because it was quite an abstract concept, and I was struggling to see how you would explain to a child what an AI did, seeing as I haven't really seen anyone give a good explanation to anyone.
No, you're completely right. So the case study involves those kind of reflections. And when we first piloted this with different councils, they also did have a struggle with, kind of implementing that, but they saw the utility of that. I would direct you to maybe looking at UNESCO's Child Design Code and the different elements that they involve in there to see how we can explain these kind of concepts to different age groups, especially children. I think co-design with children is a very important part of it, and possibly, and answering the question that you had about how we go about doing that is perhaps actually building that ecosystem where we start giving those explanations. Often we're treated by or mediated, our actions are mediated by AI systems, but we're not really given an explanation. But as we begin building that, we can maybe build on a shared vocabulary that is better implementable. So I'm not saying there are very specific cases where this has been implemented and they've got outstanding outcomes. I think it does change context to context, child to child, and family to family. But there are resources out there to better inform how these explanations are given to children. And I think that giving those explanations is a starting ground as this technology develops.
Okay.
Did that answer your question? I'm happy to share the resources as well.
I think it gave me somewhere to start. I need to do some reading around this, but yeah, it's like I said, it's sort of, I didn't know if you had an example. I mean, without sort of giving sort of personal details of sort of, this is how you would explain to a 5-year-old that they were being taken into care. Because I imagine that even before AI was a thing, that was a very, very difficult conversation to have.
No, you're right. I don't have a very specific example of that. We used a lot of we used cases of AI being used in children's social care, but all again in a very abstract way. We didn't have specific data from children on whom this is being used, because this was meant to be a starting stage of reflection on practices within the industry.
Okay, so thank you.
Okay, so if anybody online's got any questions, please either raise your hand and I'll call on you, or just drop a question in the chat and I'll read it out. Apart from that, any questions in the room? Yep, right.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I was wondering, in your opinion, do you think there should be punishments for people that develop AI without following any sorts of ethical guidelines? Because I don't know, for example, if a restaurant doesn't follow certain health-related guidelines, then the police might intervene. And the restaurant, some restaurants at least have a considerably smaller reach than some of these AI models you talked about, so that affect more people. So I don't know.
No, that's a really interesting question. I won't give my personal opinion on this, because that's hard to give like a concluding statement on this. But I think this is why there's a lot of work being put into regulations and standards for AI systems, from the kind of data that's being used to how it's being designed to how it's being tested and so forth. And if this standardization and these regulations are put into place, then companies or communities that are using AI systems that are causing harm will be held responsible for their actions. But there are a lot of challenges with it. For instance, we did some work with the Department of Health and Social Care, where we interviewed a number of individuals, including some from the MHRA for healthcare regulation. And they gave us a really interesting case where it wasn't just that, because of the ways in which standards and regulations are defined, and the ways in which the private sector works in this field, there are a lot of issues that come from their interaction with this regulatory space. So you have cases where an AI system or a software or a technology might not work well on a large group of people because of, say, the data that was being used or the kind of metrics that they used in order to come to those algorithmically defined outcomes. what companies have done in the past is to then change their audience to not be for general use, but go back to being for this very specific audience. So if you got a model that was trained only on health data from certain, from say, men of a particular higher social income group within the UK, and it doesn't perform well on, say, refugee women who are pregnant from Somalia, they're just going to change the intended audience so that they can pass those regulations and thus not really circumvent, but not really be held responsible in that way, because they are stating that this can only be used on a certain group. Now this is legally fine, but what does that mean ethically for a larger group of people? That you have all these different technologies being developed, but not everyone can access it because it's not capable of it doesn't generalize well on all these different groups. So is it then that these groups just never have access to better technology because the company in charge of it chose not to involve these different data subgroups? Again, here, like there are these big questions about how R&D is being developed and what that means for regulation. So just to sum up, again, there are regulations in place to hold these companies and individuals accountable, and they should be held accountable to, again, set a precedent that free use of AI systems that discriminate or harm other individuals should not be tolerated. But at the same time, there are also with this rapid change in this ecosystem, there's a lot more work to be done to keep this ecosystem dynamic for innovation, but also in a way that holds these different groups accountable.
Thank you.
I had a question. So just kind of taking things back to the very beginning. So I think everyone agrees that we need to have some kind of framework in place. We need to have some kind of protection for the tools that people are making. But the recommendations that you make, what is that based on? So it's a very, obviously the uptake of AI and AI itself is like quite new in society. So are we kind of going back to sort of pure kind of ethical first principles? Is it based on cases that went wrong? Is it sort of evidence-based, or is it sort of, I guess, like philosophy-based? And then also assuming that our ethics will evolve with time, so things that were acceptable in the 2020s may no longer be acceptable in the 2030s. Do you have a feeling for how these evolving ethical landscapes will affect things that already exist?
No, that's a really important question. I think there will be, as you mentioned, this evolving approach to the different kind of things that we find ethically sound. Again, what people have tolerated like 100 years ago would not be something that we tolerate now when it comes to ethical behavior, not even involving technology. But that ethical and moral drivers that we have also change, say, geographically. It can change from, say, it can change from even within a city to rural areas. So when it comes to those kind of philosophical confrontations, it is really hard to really map out what the future of it will look like. But for now, and the work that we've done, we've tried to sum this based on existing ethical consensus on how this should be implemented. And working with organizations that have been looking at these kind of concepts for years. So say we worked with the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Equality in the UK and worldwide, implementing that is far harder. There is a certain line of defense, but again, implementation and ensuring that there is the right to non-discrimination is upheld. You can often see there are those cases that come up where we're like, is this law really doing its job well? So those jurisprudence questions are going to keep coming. It's not that they're not. It will keep evolving, but the work that we've done tried to build on the work of these organizations, the kind of laws that currently exist to have that ethical defense against discriminatory use or unfair use of AI systems.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a question in the chat. This is from Joseph. Apologies if I missed this in the talk, but how does the PGB framework interact with legislation from the EU AI Act? I worry that frameworks such as the PBG or the Bristol Data Hazards Project may not be utilised as much as they could be.
No, it's interesting. I think so. This project has been many years in the making, far before the EU AI Act was finally passed as well. But again, a lot of this isn't meant to mandate your the ways in which you work towards doing things. If I could just share some of the resources, and if you look through the workbooks and the kind of templates that we have for each of them, they are a way of providing the rationale and providing someone to be held accountable. They're not rigid, standards that need to be followed. So there is that level of dynamism which would make it suitable for implementation alongside the EU AI Act. Again, the EU AI Act upholds those questions of accountability, of making sure that there are moratoria and so forth. But that's also only within the EU jurisdiction, and it doesn't apply to the UK anymore. But that doesn't mean public sector and industry shouldn't start working towards implementing, frameworks like the PBG or the data hazards framework as well, to, again, start monitoring, accounting, and logging the different decisions that are being made for a later stage, so that they can justify the decisions being made or be held accountable for their actions.
Okay, I hope that answered your question, Joseph. Do you have any other questions in the room? David?
I was going to ask, a lot of the large language models are there's only 2 or 3 very big ones done by Google and OpenAI and various other things. Those are mostly trained on data sets which they will not admit where they came from, but it's fairly clear they just took the internet and fed it into their models, which means there's an awful lot of copyright violation and so on. Most of the AI models I've seen have been minor repackagings of that. They just add they basically use those frameworks as the underlying engine and add a couple of rules around it. Are those ones that would be unacceptable in your framework because they haven't gone through all of these in the original conception, or are these ones that could be adapted for use in this framework if they could be shown to be suitable?
No, that's really interesting, and that's something we're currently looking at, because again, as I mentioned before, this was something that was prepared, far before we saw the boom of generative AI as it expanded. So now we're trying to see how the implementation of this framework would be as it responds to LLMs, to other models that use existing, creative work of, artists, of authors, of all these different groups of people who are not being rightly given their royalties and so forth. So there is some more work that we are looking at doing to make sure that there is that consensus between the generative AI side and this framework. But as I mentioned before, we've tried to keep it as open as possible to make sure that, again, this works as an accounting mechanism, that we start accounting for all those data decisions. So say, company A has built this LLM that's just data scraping across the internet. They have to log that they were data scraping across the internet, and further along the line, if there is legislation that's implemented that does involve some kind of fine or any kind of intervention for those kind of actions, because they go against because maybe it deals with copyright infringement, there is a record of that data being used, as well as someone to hold accountable for those decisions.
Yeah, so I'm interested in the story behind the story a little bit. I'd love to get a reminder of who wrote the framework and kind of how long it has been in the works, and have industry kind of have a say in what ends up. I get the sense that it's a very sort of carefully put together framework.
Yeah, so the director of the ethics and responsible research innovation here at the Turing, David Leslie, wrote the first guidance, Understanding AI Ethics and Safety. And this was way back in I want to say 2011, but I could be very wrong about this. So give me a second. But just to emphasize how long it's been, it was far before I joined, and I've been at the Turing for 3 years. So do the math. So it's probably not 2011, but I feel like the number 2011 is there in my head. But yeah, does that answer your question on who was there? I think you had another part to it.
Yeah, I remember once asking, hearing from an expert in AI in industry about the fast changing legislative landscape, and that they have to explain things to MPs that they don't know yet. And I said, is there a risk of you marking your own homework? And they said, well, we hope to. Is there a risk of ethical interloping in writing these frameworks?
Yeah, no, that does raise a really important ethical conundrum. But again, it's not. We aren't, civil servants. This framework and this program is meant to train the public sector bodies and civil servants in understanding the different risks that arise with it. So we're not civil servants telling other civil servants, hey, you should say A, B, and C in order to get away from data protection legislation B, section C. But it's mostly just to advise or guide how public sector approaches the use of AI design, development, and deployment for public services. Again, this is not a mandated framework under UK law. This is just a guide to implement better ethical practices in your AI work.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I was wondering how this relates to kind of cooperation between parties in different countries. So let's say you have a government agency collaborating with a project with another government agency in a country that's got similar values, similar concerns. I imagine there's kind of no problem if you can trust their data was acquired fairly. You can trust their models have been checked for bias. But if you're working with somebody who has either kind of fewer concerns or is actively is kind of weighing up the pros and cons and says I'd rather kind of cut back on some of the protections in favor of the benefits. What is the ethical kind of onus on us in that case? Because you can imagine sort of people be willing to sort of kind of black site some of their kind of AI development in some way. If this is happening in a different country, I'm just getting the data. My hands are clean. How does that all come together?
Well, thankfully, there is legislation to ensure that that doesn't happen. Or even say within the research domain, you have to do your you have to go through your ethics processes to make sure that you're not working with either groups or countries that might raise red flags for the research institute or the government body that you're working with. So there are those considerations that have always been there, whether or not it's AI systems. Those kind of considerations have been there. But if what you're trying to say is, what does this work like when it comes to partnerships or, maybe procurement of systems, if that's kind of where you're getting at in, say, if an AI system, what Microsoft Copilot was being used, was procured in order to use it, that still doesn't take away from the use of this framework, because you still have to get those data considerations from Copilot. You still need to get an understanding of the explainability if you want to feasibly deploy these systems. Now, whilst it might not have any legal mandate that, my Copilot has to give you these answers, or the government expects you to fill out all of this in order to implement this program, it does, at least through this training program, build that atmosphere of critical reflection when it comes to developing AI systems, rather than just say, this is easy, it's cost efficient, let's just use it and move on with it. We start asking those questions of, okay, it's easy and it's cost efficient, but how many people am I harming in the use of this system? Am I able to explain to my constituents why I've used the system, how the system made the decision that it made, the kind of data that went in that system? And those are, and again, it's those critical reflections that we're trying to really hammer on and build that shared vocabulary when it comes to approaching ethical practices in AI.
Great, thank you. Any more questions in the room? Okay, well, I've got about 10 more, so maybe I'll just ask one more. So in terms of kind of broader AI safety and regulation, let's say if we kind of cast forward 10 years from now, do you think that people who are developing AI, how will that process ideally be managed? Are we talking about maybe people have to be accredited in AI development, like they go through some kind of chartered AI development kind of process in order to be legally allowed to do this? Or are we talking more of a system where, like, you have companies like TUV, whose job it is to sort of provide quality control and assurance of these kind of projects? Or is it just going to be, legally you have to kind of prove that you've gone through, say, your frameworks that you're kind of putting in place, and that's kind of good enough? What do you think the landscape looks like in 10 years?
That's interesting. In some ways, I think what the current, and again, I'm going to speak from the UK perspective, or the UK landscape. Current, domain-specific regulatory bodies are also implementing AI-specific regulations. Like I mentioned, the MHRA, for instance, or different bodies are implementing either regulatory regulations or standards or guidances and frameworks to ensure that, in the future, all of this is accounted for, which I think is a good way. I hate to use that sentence of why reinvent the wheel. So when you have organizations that have domain expertise that are regulating within their domain, that's great. And I think 10 years down the line, there's going to be a lot more cross-pollination across industries or cross-sharing of resources. And I'm hoping by the time that happens, we're not playing catch up as usual, and we're not doing governance after the fact, but we're at least implementing well in advance. Might not even be this framework, but we're implementing methods to ensure that when there is, cross industry work being done, that there is some kind of standard on how decisions are being taking place, and the kind of behavior that's there within these industries, and an accountability mechanism for everyone who's part of these project teams. But again, I think the current landscape of these regulatory authorities within the UK is doing a good enough job. It would be in the future, I think there would be more maybe technology specific laws that might come up, instead of having very general rules, maybe something a bit more specific. But that's just my perspective on where things could go in 10 years time.
Yeah, I mean, and then you even get into the conversation of what even is AI. Are some machine learning models are AI, or is it just large language models, computer vision? Where do you draw the line of, okay, beyond this point, I need to start worrying about considerations. But before that, it's just statistics, and it's fine. I don't have to think about it. It's
exactly. Yeah, and there's a lot of research out there where, even with the EU AI Act, a lot of individuals have said that this definition does not cover well enough. But you have another side that says, no, it's dynamic or flexible enough to cover future developments that might happen in the field. But I think until there are those cases where people, I guess, are being taken to court, that's when you're going to get a lot more case law that can, provide more clarity on how this is going to be implemented. But no, that you're right when it comes to that, on the different things that are considered AI, whether it's just data-driven systems, whether it has to be algorithmically driven, whether it involves neural networks or just basic probability modeling, all of that are really important considerations. And if I'm not mistaken, for a lot of regulations, they do have specifics for each of this. But again, that's only for like those safety critical regulations, again, like healthcare, for instance. Because it's safety critical, they have this level of advancement when it comes to their regulations. But I can imagine other areas might still have to develop their frameworks and regulations to respond to this.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, you were saying earlier about having to find somebody responsible at each kind of point in the cycle, but then you have the question of, well, what does it mean to be responsible? Being responsible is, if it goes wrong, you're accountable in some way and you have some punishment. So I just had a picture in my mind of, like, some developer who was, kind of bad at coding and then ends up kind of getting arrested for that, years down the line.
Yeah, but it might also be the industry that, was aware, like, we're never a single person working, but there is a larger team as well who approved that. What was your ethical process? Things like that. Again, making sure there are logs of all these decisions and people within the system would be important.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I imagine yeah, we've got massive public sector organizations like the NHS, which are presumably doing a lot of work to kind of show best practice in this regard. So before we finish, I'll just say, so Joseph responded to your question about, how's it interact with the EU AI Act and Bristol Data Hazards Project. Joseph says, makes sense. My point is that even though the AI Act isn't UK law, it is very unlikely that UK businesses will not be following it. A trivial example would be bottle caps attached to bottles. Cynically, any business that voluntarily follows non-legally binding frameworks would also be doing so as a form of corporate social responsibility, and so not given that much importance.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I can't say it's, I wish I could provide a different defense for the way this current like governance landscape is, but unfortunately that is the case. And maybe if I could just conclude, there was this really interesting point being made in another conversation that I was having where folks said there's no point telling a single company to slow down. Google isn't going to slow down because that means OpenAI is going to take over, Microsoft is going to take over. So you have these industries that have this, this very vicious capitalist approach to, doing as much as possible, producing as much as possible, and being the best within their sector. So they're not going to slow down if everyone else isn't going to slow down. So there has to be that entire ecosystem-wide, checks and balances that need to take place.
Yeah,
and with the EU AI Act that eventually, tumbles down to the rest of the world just by sheer purchasing power of the bloc.
Yeah, well, I imagine in the States where these companies are going to have some very strong lobbyists. It's going to make sure things go in their way. And yeah, their move fast and break things approach is a little bit scary in this context. All right, well, thanks, Smera, one more time for an amazing talk.
Thank you so much.
So next month's seminar is with Ewan MacDonald of the University of Liverpool, who will be talking about bioinformatics and the curse of dimensionality, which is not a Harry Potter novel. It's actually, super interesting talk about how health data can be used in different contexts. So see you all there. Thanks, Smera.
Bye.